You never really get over the first one. Not completely. Even now, after all the years. The therapy, the carefully constructed walls I've built around my heart. The memory of Clarissa Thorne still flares up like a stubborn match on a windy day. 8 years ago, I stood in a navy blue suit that felt too expensive for a guy who had just finished paying off his student loans. The diamond ring sat in my palm, catching the last bit of afternoon sun as I rehearsed my lines in front of the mirror. My chest was tight with anticipation, the kind that comes from thinking you've finally figured out how to be someone's forever. She was Clarissa Thorne, intelligent, magnetic. So alive that when she walked into a room, the air itself seemed to hum in response. I'd always been a little quieter, a little more cautious. But with her, I felt like I could stretch myself into something larger, better, more complete. We met at a conference about sustainable architecture. She'd been presenting on integrating green spaces into urban design, and I'd been the guy in the third row, scribbling notes like a freshman in love because I was. She smiled at me afterward. That electric smile, that made me believe in things like fate. From there, everything moved fast. Coffee dates turned into late-night phone calls. Phone calls turned into weekends together. Weekends turned into shared toothbrush holders and secret glances across crowded rooms. I wanted to marry her almost from the start, but I waited, convinced that timing mattered. I wanted it to be perfect. I spent months picking out the ring, a small diamond, simple, classic, but nestled in a setting I'd spent hours choosing. I wanted her to feel like it had always belonged on her finger, like it was made just for her. On the night I planned to propose, we were supposed to meet at our favorite spot by the lake, where the city skyline turned into a painting behind her hair. But she never showed. My calls went straight to voicemail. My texts stayed unanswered. I waited for an hour, then 2. Finally, I drove by her apartment, convinced something terrible had happened. That's when I saw them. The moving boxes, stacked neatly by the curb. Bryce, my brother, stood there, leaning against the hood of his car, his arms crossed, a smirk that could slice skin. Clarissa was beside him, her eyes hidden behind sunglasses, even though the sun had already dipped below the horizon. I remember the way my heart sank, like a stone through water, when she turned and looked at me, with that blank expression, like I was a stranger, no explanation, no goodbye, just a new address, scribbled in Sharpie on a box marked fragile. 3 weeks later, my mother called. Her voice was so strained I could barely understand her. "They eloped," she said. "Your brother and Clarissa, they got married in Maui." I hung up and stared at the walls of my empty apartment for what felt like years. I think part of me went dead that day. The world stopped making sense. The betrayal didn't come with a loud crash. It was a quiet, seeping kind of pain. That bled into everything. I didn't cry. Not then. Not for a long time. I packed a single suitcase and drove out of town without telling anyone. I buried my heart in silence. Told myself I'd start again, and I did. Sort of. I built a new life on the other side of the state. Got a job that paid enough to keep the lights on. Dated half-heartedly, but no one lasted more than a few months, every time. I thought about getting serious. I'd remember that night by the lake and the way Clarissa looked at me, like I didn't matter. I thought I'd put it all behind me, until last week. Our mother died. Cancer. Fast and cruel, the way these things often are. I spoke to her a few days before she passed. Her voice was a fragile thread of the woman who used to hold us all together. She asked me to come home for the funeral. I owed her that much. So I did. I packed a black suit, ironed a white shirt, and drove through the town that used to feel like home. The funeral home was a low-slung building off the main road, a place that smelled like roses and disinfectant. I parked across the street and sat in the car for a few minutes. My hands trembling on the steering wheel, I thought about walking in, offering a polite smile, nodding at neighbors I hadn't seen in years. I thought about Mom, about how she used to make Sunday dinners, how she'd insist that no matter how busy we were, we'd sit down together. I thought about the little house on Birchwood Drive, with the creaky floors, the way she always put fresh flowers in the kitchen. I didn't think about Clarissa, or at least, I tried not to. But when I finally walked in and saw Bryce standing by the casket, Clarissa on his arm, it was like every wound split open at once. He didn't argue, because he knew. Deep down, he knew. Clarissa always needed someone to manage, someone to mold. She'd once told me that I was easy to handle because I didn't fight her on the little things. I thought that was a compliment. Back then, like being agreeable made me worthy of love. But now, I know better. Love wasn't supposed to be a negotiation. It wasn't supposed to feel like giving up pieces of yourself, just to keep the peace. Serena taught me that. She taught me that love could be built, that it could be a partnership, not a power struggle. I didn't need someone who saw me as a project. I needed someone who saw me as a partner. Bryce stood there, hands in his pockets. The tension in his jaw betrayed the panic underneath. "I didn't mean for it to happen that way," he muttered, his voice almost too soft to hear. "Clarissa, she made me feel like a king," I finished for him. My tone bitter, but calm. "She made you feel like you deserved it all, didn't she? Like you were owed something the rest of us had to earn. But that's the thing about illusions, Bryce. They're only real if you're too scared to look behind." "The curtain." He looked at me then. Really looked at me. Like he was seeing a different man than the one he'd left behind 8 years ago. Maybe he was. Maybe I'd grown too much for him to recognize. That thought gave me a quiet satisfaction. I let the silence stretch until he couldn't stand it anymore. "So that's it?" he said finally, his voice breaking in places I'd never heard before. "You're just done? With us? With her? With me?" I shook my head slowly, feeling the weight of the years settle into my bones. "I'm not done, Bryce.